It's actually the most exciting part of the meetup.
Say something again.
1, 2, 3. Test, test, test.
That's you.
Yeah?
You just pegged up you first. And all for you.
Beautiful.
Sweet. So yeah, go for it.
All right, so we're going to talk about, cloud and open source. I'm Richard from Pivotal. I'm not representing Pivotal. I'm just representing Adron Finding a Speaker. So I've been a developer for, 20-ish years. Most of my career in the beginning was in the Microsoft space. This whole open source thing didn't really matter to me much, actually, until he and I worked at a job about 7 years ago. They actually started paying attention to open source. And then, I think all of our vision is it's just, it's all of us fighting the man, building software that we don't have to go buy it from big enterprise companies anymore. We're in these magical communities running shirtless, apparently through fields. Like that's how we kind of think of a lot of us open source versus kind of the real life of open source, a little more jarring. It's muscular kangaroos potentially jostling each other, but it's a little more rough and tumble now, especially. It's not just we're all building open source because it's fun and we like doing it. Instead, it seems like all the commercial vendors are actually using open source to keep selling me stuff. Are we kind of losing some of the spirit of it? Is cloud actually messing this up a little bit? So, the Cloudera founder said this a few years back. What's amazing, though, if you look back the last decade, has anything of significance come out that's not been open source? And yes, there's things like Splunk and other great tech, but if you look at foundational tech, hasn't it all been in open source for the last decade, which is pretty awesome, right, when we think about that. So open source has this giant impact, even if it's maybe not as unicorns and fairy tales as it was before. And there's an amazing number of companies making a lot of money on open source. So there's a great spreadsheet online you can find that just lists, it's a constantly updated list of all the companies making $100 million more as a foundational open source company. So clearly someone is making money on open source. Pivotal is one, as are many, many companies, HashiCorp, all these companies we know and love. So there's business to be had in being an open source company. But we're in this weird phase, especially the last 6 to 12 months, of companies wondering kind of what's the future of some of this open source stuff. You have MariaDB, CEO, using the term you see a lot now, is cloud strip mining open source? Are they just taking all this blood, sweat, and tears of open source, selling it as a service, not contributing anything back, and kind of hosing the community, right? That's kind of the subtext in a lot of stuff nowadays. And hey, does the open source community have to get real and stop pretending that this is all altruistic and realizing it's always been a business, whether they liked it or not? At the same time, hey, open source has the problem with monetization. Amazon's just doing what they're supposed to do. If you can't make money on open source, that's a you problem, software vendors, some of the contention. Hey, cloud's going to devour open source. Good luck with that, right? The cloud's going to come in. No one's going to want to install software again. It's all as a service. Have fun building that database that we're going to now take and sell as a service. It goes on and on. You have Redis Labs doing some licensing changing, which we'll talk about. I mean, if you want to come to a meetup to talk about software licenses, you have picked the right one. So it's going to get pretty crazy in here. I got to be honest with you. So we're going to talk software licensing. And my friend Asim, who builds that great micro library for Go, if you're a Go developer, you probably use Go Micro in a lot of cases, kind of complaining like, hey, this was after some of the recent even Elasticsearch stuff from the last week. Hey, build this great project, lurk in the shadows, wait till it's successful, and then fork it and make all the money. Wash, rinse, repeat, right? So there's this vibe in open source that cloud is just this sort of behemoth that comes in and kind of screws things up. Is that the case? I guess we'll see in this action-packed 30 minutes. So what are we going to do? So we're going to talk a little bit about open source strategies. How do companies even try to make money on this stuff in the first place? And I actually would love to hear some of your feedback for where I get this wrong or what things you would add to this list. We'll look at kind of the current state of affairs, and then I'm going to close with just a series of questions that we'll either talk about now or while we're all getting sauced up next door. And maybe you'll give me real answers if you're holding back here. All right, so let's talk about the open source strategies. How do companies from almost the beginning of time make any money on this stuff? And so there's a few strategies. Now, we have to stop for a second and recognize first, there is no such thing as an open source business strategy. Don't ever say that, right? There is no such thing as that, right? You can't do that. The only business strategy that exists is what my colleague Andrew Clay Schaefer says is you need to sell something for more than it costs you to make it. That is the universal business strategy. So there's no such thing as an open source one. You need to probably have a business if you expect to survive in capitalist America. So what are your options? So the old tried and trusted software and services, right? What is this? So this means I'm going to go ahead and take some software. It's all open source entirely. I'm not holding anything back. And I'm going to make some money selling services, documentation, training, break fix support, right? A really traditional way a lot of people get started in this space is doing this whole services and support model. So who does this? Red Hat does this with Linux, right? Everything's out there. Canonical does this with Ubuntu, right? I mean, who else do you think does services and support? Because I, trolled some lists, people I know. Who else do you think does totally open source and just makes money selling services? Yeah.
Oracle does now with Java support. They charge for it.
My friend from Oracle, yes, Java, technically all open source. And then they come and chase you down later for licensing. Good. So what are the considerations here? This is the default model for a lot of companies. One can argue Red Hat's the only company that ever has made an actual business out of this. The hard part's low margin, right? You're going to get maybe 1% of your customers actually paying you for the software. It's tough to scale that. It's tough to become a real at-scale business selling services and support. For many of these single project owner open source projects, you can sell a consulting business on the side for this. That's a cool living. But you're not going to become maybe a $100 million company selling services and support. That's really tough nowadays. And the other thing I've noticed is that if my business is helping you install my open source, at sometimes this can create a negative incentive to say, gosh, if I make it a lot easier, my whole consulting business dries up. So do I have an incentive to keep this software difficult? Now that might not be on purpose, right? Not in the back of your mind going, can I make this as hard as possible to fund my consulting? But there's at least potentially that in the back of your mind that making this a lot easier is maybe not good for me professionally. And so this is kind of fading in support, and very few companies I see nowadays starting off this. Now again, the individual person does it, but not as a whole. The one that's obviously a lot of people are doing with is open core. So what is something like open core? Open core says I'm going to have a foundational piece of this software that's open source, and I'm going to layer on things that people pay for on top of that. So it's still very useful by itself. It just means if I want to do some of the enterprisey stuff and things like that, I'm going to charge you for that. Now this is a pretty dominant model nowadays. Who does this? So Pivotal does this. We're the company behind Cloud Foundry and technology like that. Confluent does this with Kafka. Redis Labs does this with Redis. Elastic does this with Elasticsearch. HashiCorp, actually I didn't realize this till yesterday when I was digging through these, has enterprise versions of all their stuff, from Console to Terraform to all those, right? And they're still useful by themselves. But if I want all the collaboration stuff, I want the enterprise stuff, the HA stuff, all that's at a cost. Now, it's not a bad model. Anybody else I left off this list, who do you see doing open core? Like they have core stuff, but then they're clearly selling you add-ons. Yeah?
Say Elastic.
Yeah, I said Elastic. Okay.
MongoDB.
Mongo does that, sure, yeah.
GitLab is
That's a good one. GitLab does that as well.
DataStax.
DataStax, that evil company there, they do it a lot. Anybody else? Open core?
Maybe?
Spring? No.
The Spring framework, don't they don't.
No, that's us too, so I have to be honest. No, so Spring is entirely 100% open source. And I do list them on one of these other strategies as well. So, the considerations here. So when you're doing this, it's popular. Most of the things you see people focus on is like installation, right? Installing open source, big systems is not easy. So a lot of it's around installation, upgrade processes, HA deployments, right? Team collaboration-y stuff. What's tricky is that constant discussion of what goes into the public domain versus what do I hold back. I frankly see us have this discussion at Pivotal all the time. What kind of things do we hold back as proprietary? What do we put in the open source? So you do open that up into a discussion. And really tricky is the foundation model. So if your technology is part of a foundation where you have 20 companies all contributing, how are you deciding who gets to hold what back, who puts what into open source? So this is a good model for a single company sort of contributor model, Kafka, Redis, where there's other contributors but much smaller. This is a little harder when you have this sort of committee-based model. Increasingly, managed service keeps popping up. So this is saying, I'm going to run that software as a service, and the customers don't deal with any operational stuff. Increasingly, you see people say this is how you can fight the cloud providers, is you have to offer your software as a service. So who does this? So Mongo does this with Atlas, which is pretty good stuff. Confluent does it, their Confluent Cloud. Hey, look at WordPress, the most popular open source product, I think, overall on the planet. And all the public cloud providers, for better or for worse, take open source and service the hell out of it for everyone to consume as a service. That's their main value, is making sure that I'm going to consume it in a digestible way. Who else? Who else does great managed service stuff in open source? Other people come to mind? No? So, big investment. right? You're getting in a data center business. You're getting in a business of running software, patching software, doing multi-tenancy, billing strategies. You're selling a subscription where it's easier for people to just try it and jump off or do Bitcoin mining or whatever else people do in free accounts.
Oracle does it.
The Bitcoin mining?
Cloud customer.
Oh, okay, cloud
It's our
customer.
box, it's in your data center, we manage it, we run it.
Yeah. Sonar Cloud? Yep.
Fabricator is another example.
What's that do? Fabricator?
They're a task management and project management and Git repo hosting thing that came spun out of Facebook into its own company. So
Nice, okay.
similar to GitLab.
Yeah, good. So, which one? Linester? Oh, like Lightstep, yeah, got it. What I've noticed is it's interesting is, and I mentioned that last one, standalone services, because to me, for example, would I use a database as a service from someone in their location and then still try to connect that to my low latency app running in compute somewhere else? Would I want to pay a 200 millisecond charge to use a database as a service somewhere? So to me, this strikes me as this is a great option if I can run it in the cloud. And Atlas does this actually really well. I can run managed Mongo in the cloud of your choice, even do VPC peering and things like that, which is actually really neat. If I were running MongoDB in their own data centers, I don't know who would ever use that service because I'm going to have a lag. I can't do private connectivity. So I don't know. Would I use a Kafka cloud? I mean, maybe. But I'm going to potentially be things that are low latency, or even I can tolerate latency to use those services. So I find these interesting. I just think they probably make more sense either embedded in a public cloud or as a completely standalone service. The next one we don't talk about a lot, but we probably should, is corporate sponsorship. So if we recognize that whether you like it or not, the most important open source projects are backed by a company. Oh gosh, stupid evil corporations. They're the ones funding a lot of the people who build open source. So what is this one? So this one is kind of software development's paid for either by an employer of some sort, maybe a foundation, but at least minimizes that need that you have to make money. It's potentially not even done for the core business of that company in some cases. Let me give you some examples of those. So look at Envoy. You love service mesh stuff. It's done by Lyft. What the hell does Lyft care about Envoy? Well, they love the guy who builds it, and he works there, right? And he sponsors his work. Now, if they stop it tomorrow, I don't know what happens to that. But they get no money for that. There's no business reason they're doing that necessarily. Linux Foundation, CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, like these sort of sponsoring bodies make that work possible. Netflix does all this crazy open source. None of it's core to their business. I'm not watching Orange is the New Black because they're great at service discovery. Like those are not related things. Obviously Facebook with React, Uber does a ton of open source stuff. Pivotal does the Spring framework for Java, Concourse, RabbitMQ. None of those are really money-making things for us. They're really just lots of people building cool open source stuff. Now, that one also tries to turn into money. And some of these can over time so it can blur the lines, but what else do you see? Where are else of the not business critical, right? It's not tied to them making money, but corporate sponsorship.
Joint pretty much did this with Node.
Joint with Node? Yeah, it's a great call.
Twitter did for Bootstrap.
Twitter,
Google do for
Bootstrap,
Kubernetes.
right.
Yeah,
I never knew.
The main projects are coming from here.
Right, Kubernetes kind of counts in here. I mean, obviously other companies are making money off it.
Yeah,
That was a hard one for me to
yeah.
categorize. Yeah. Who else? OpenFast. That's good, yeah, that's true.
I'm just curious, like, why do you think, like, what's attracting these corporations, like,
To do that?
sponsor?
I don't know. To me, the number one is at the end of every Netflix post about their crazy ass open source was we're hiring. So really, and if you talk to Adrian Crockcroft at the time, like he would say, like, many of these things are recruiting tools and it makes it a cool place to work. So I know you're streaming this, so maybe this is a bad thing to say. I don't think much of any of open source is altruistic. I think most of it is either making money or attracting talent. The rest of it is us pretending that it's people in their free time doing things they love. Now, some of it obviously is. But Netflix isn't doing this because they're trying to be good corporate citizens. They're trying to get the best talent, right? As there are plenty of companies in this list, and more power to them, right? Because it's hard to get great technical talent. And so if by showing that you contribute to open source and then they get to work on those cool open source things, if that gets you a great engineer, terrific. You know what? That's a really cool strategy. But to me, that's the number one reason most companies are doing that is either goodwill from the industry for that company for some reason. I don't think Facebook gets more likes because they do React, but am I going to take Uber versus Lyft because I like Envoy or Uber's big data thing more? That seems weird.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there are times where those things I think do improve that company's standing in the market, and again, it gets them better talent. Yeah.
Might Let's Encrypt and OpenStack fit into this?
Would OpenStack fit into this? I mean, I guess as part of that foundation and that work, everyone was obviously trying to monetize it, so the individual parties, Rackspace and everyone else, wanted to make money off it. So again, those are tricky ones because it's not everyone contributing generically to a project because they like it or it's a money-making thing. So those are trickier ones. I think those are just for-profit, open core sort of things. Like we're going to contribute to the core of OpenStack, and then we're going to add special stuff to it and sell it to you. But yeah, it's a tricky one. Same with Kubernetes for me.
I guess I would add Knative as well.
Knative, yeah, right. We're contributing to that. Google, SAP, IBM. Yep. Good. So this is an interesting one that, again, it's valid. So the other one that, again, I want your take on, to me, is the one where you're purposely doing it not because you're going to make any money on that thing. You will never make money on that thing, but you're trying to steer me towards something that makes us money. Now, I could argue, maybe if I'm being completely intellectually honest, that's kind of what we do with Spring and stuff at Pivotal, right? We're never going to make money on Spring, but we'd love you to use Cloud Foundry or Kubernetes, our stuff. So these are things that kind of, you're not trying to make money on the thing, I'm trying to make money on the thing that uses the thing. So for me, every consulting company that has an OSS repo, like that consulting company, Accenture, whomever, they're never going to make money on their open source. They just want to think they're awesome, so they'll sell you some services. It's cool. I mean, Microsoft's not doing Visual Studio Code because they love you, I don't think. I think they're doing it so that you push all your apps to Azure, right? I mean, .NET, and again, more power to you. I'm going to give you free software so that maybe some of that comes to my place. But what else falls into this for you? What else do you see as companies who aren't even trying to monetize the open source, but it's somehow pulling you into something else they sell? Anything else come to mind? I struggled with this. I felt like this was a model I see. I just couldn't spot it in a lot of places.
Gillette shaving.
Give away the razors, or give away the razors to get the blades. Yeah.
I feel like Linus and what is it, the open source initiative or whatever he works for. I feel like they kind of do that, but then of course, based on various numbers that were released in the newspaper, he also makes like $800,000 a year writing Git and Linux kernel stuff. So, I mean,
Yeah.
he started out as like I'm going to do this for college, altruistic experiment.
Right.
But now it's definitely turned into, it's a pseudo loss leader for some people, but it's making him.
Yeah, I mean, this strikes me as the other, like, look, VMware sells Harbor as a container registry. Ever going to make money on that? No, but it sells Pivotal Container Service, VMware PKS. Sure, right, that makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of open source projects, probably at the big companies, where they're throwing them off as interesting ideas with the hope of you buying compute in the public cloud or things like that. Every Amazon project, right, seems to be, how do we lead all roads lead back to there?
What about Android?
Android, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Has Google made any money on that? I guess they do through licensing.
Well, they do insurance.
Yeah. I mean, even Microsoft yesterday, shipped a new tool for Postgres management that I can point at any Postgres cluster. Like, is that thing will never make money for them. That will always cost them money, but maybe I'll use the Azure Postgres database now. Maybe I'll use things like that. So it seems like a lot of these dev tooling, operational tooling things can fit the bill.
Can be part of this, all the email, like Hotmail, Gmail.
Yeah, Hotmail, Gmail, some of those, sure. We all assume they should be up all the time. We've never paid for it. Yeah. Yeah, one in the back.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, the other aspect of it is also, like, you know, like, you can put an MVP out there and then, let the community shape, because I think that's kind of the true intent.
Sure. No, that's fair. You put something out there, see if it takes off without over-investing. That's a fair point. So, yeah, considerations for this, we've talked about those here. So the last one, which is, again, I should include, plenty of people do open source for professional development. And sometimes this turns into real stuff. Sometimes it's just personally enjoyable. Our friend Brad Wilson, who works at Microsoft, built XUnit framework. I don't think he's ever made a dime off it. I think he likes it. It helps the community, and he works at Microsoft now, and that probably hasn't hurt. But it's professional development, right? I like building and sharing new stuff. For people in this room who do open source, you're probably doing it because you like it. You like contributing, issuing a pull request, fixing their docs, right? It's professionally good. You see surveys that say a good number of people who contribute to open source are doing it for their resume. It's professional development. It looks good. That's cool. It's a cool way to learn stuff. So who does this? Gosh, a lot of people, right? So I'm not trying to paint this picture. It's only evil corporations doing open source. Obviously, plenty of individuals do for professional, but this is a hobbyist for the most part because we have to actually, eat food and have homes. So the hard part is we all assume, how many times you read about the burnout of some of these individual open source project owners who are up all night getting a list of issues. Everyone's assuming they should get full support. They've never paid for anything. But you need to fix this, accept this pull request. I'm not even giving you a pull request. I'm just filing an issue that this thing sucks. My gosh, that's not even my job. Nobody pays me for this. So you have seen some of these things pop up where it's actually, not even kind of tip jar stuff, but actually some companies forming around them, actually finding ways to fund some of these individual folks who are doing it as a passion project, but they need some money. So that seems to pop up a fair bit, and I'm still glad people do that. All right, so that's how people kind of make money on this stuff so far. So let's look at the current state of things. Why are we in flux right now? Because no doubt, you all have chosen to talk about open source here together on a Tuesday evening, so kudos to you. I think this is still one of the most important questions facing software right now, is what is this relationship between open source development and the cloud providers, who are clearly doing a great job monetizing it. So let's talk about the top open source projects. Now this is from GitHub, so this doesn't include the WordPresses and the Linux and all those sorts of things. But these were the top projects last year in open source, according to GitHub, obviously based on that. So based on most contributors in a lot of this cases. So Visual Studio Code, TensorFlow stuff, Ansible, Kubernetes. That's interesting, right? All right, some interesting projects there that represent the highest number of contributors. This is the horrifyingly cool but scary Cloud Native Computing Foundation picture of just all these amazing open source projects that are out here for config management, orchestrators, right? Platform, security, key management. So we're in a very healthy place, right? Tons of really interesting open source, a lot of it in the middleware space, some of it in UI framework, some of it in app dev framework. So we're in this really good place of tons of great open source coming out. We are not in some sort of desert wasteland at the moment. But when we look at who contributes, let's be honest. If you go to and look at the stats here and look at who contributes to Kubernetes, you can actually pull up these numbers yourself. This is all public. So who are the top contributors? Google, Red Hat, VMware, IBM, Huawei, Microsoft, independent, somewhere in there, Intel, Amazon, Pivotal. This is not being built by the hobbyist, right? Kubernetes is built by big companies investing a ton of money. I don't know, sobering, I guess, realistic, sure. Love that Disney Interactive's on there. So get yourself some Kubernetes with a side of Mickey. That's great. Now overall, if we look at the whole Cloud Native Computing Foundation, all those different projects, who's contributing? It's kind of the same folks, right? Google, Red Hat, VMware, Lyft a little bit in there, IBM. So just this reminder, Alibaba, Docker, Amazon, this is still work done by big companies. This is not done at the hobbyist level. The big companies are funding a lot of people to work on open source. That's just where we are today, right? That's where this stuff's happening. So what does some of this mean? Well, if you look at the big cloud providers, how are they commercializing open source? How are they taking some of those things in that Cloud Native Computing Foundation picture? How are they taking those projects they're contributing to in some cases and making money off them? So what's Amazon offer? Well, Elastic, they've got the MapReduce stuff, Elasticsearch. They run the managed streaming service for Kafka, MQ, the active MQ service, ECS for Kubernetes, Aurora, it's a couple different database engines. RDS has a bunch of engines. DocumentDB pretends to be Mongo. Elasticache, Redis, or Memcached. You've got OpsWorks with Chef and Puppet, right? So they have taken at least the database tier in a lot of cases, some of compute, and commercialized a lot of it, right? Making a lot of money off it. Now, a lot of controversy a bit with things like DocumentDB, which isn't even Mongo. They made it look like Mongo with an API. Meanwhile, because they didn't want to pay Mongo licensing stuff. This gets a little interesting. What's Microsoft do here, though? So Microsoft, they've productized and they sell Spark and they do Hadoop. And again, they make their event hubs kind of look like Kafka. It's not running Kafka. They just make it pretend to be Kafka. They've got a Kubernetes service. They also have a database that pretends to be Mongo, pretends to be Cassandra, right? They've done those things. Postgres database, MySQL, MariaDB, Redis, right? So again, a lot of things at the data tier. This is how the cloud providers are making a lot of money, commercializing this stuff. Our friends at Google, right? They're doing MySQL and Postgres, Kubernetes, of course, Istio, Apache Beam for their data flow process, Spark and Hadoop, Redis, TensorFlow. So again, these are all, for the most part, not their own projects. Some cases they are, like Kubernetes. But for the most part, these are popular open source products that the cloud providers have turned into a service and are now making a lot of money on. Totally fair. You can all do it today. You can all take open source projects and make money off them, right? Nothing prevents that. Now, they're running at a scale that probably no one in this room individually, of course, is capable of matching. And is that the dynamic that's changed a bit here? I think that's the question, right? Has the cloud ushered in a new era of consumption that makes it unfair to the software vendor who's maybe trying to build it on their own? But if you look at their pages, Amazon's got a nice little open source at Amazon page. Here's all the things they contribute to. A lot of stuff. Amazon does a lot of open source, bless you. So they do a ton of projects, contribute to a lot of things. They get a lot of grief for not being a good open source contributor, but they do some stuff. Microsoft doing a weird giant bear hug of open source lately. It's fine. It's legit. They're doing a ton of good open source stuff. It just feels unnatural for plenty of people. And of course, Google has their own page as well on what they're doing with open source. And they're among the best in terms of doing the open source we all use, things like Go, things like Kubernetes, TensorFlow. So they've done a good job actually putting into the public domain really useful open source. So when we think about all that, the biggest challenge that's come up is if you look in general, okay, cloud industry is valued at a ton. Most of their workloads are coming from these small open source driven companies that aren't actually making that much money. So are we in a weird imbalance, right? These companies are actually building those open source projects that those cloud providers are monetizing. They're not nearly making the revenue and all the money that the public clouds are. Is that weird? Is that bad? And I think the question you have to ask yourself is, to some extent, how does that happen? We have to remember Amazon's not necessarily making money selling Redis. They're making money selling it as a service, right? What I want to buy is highly available, redundant Redis. And if that comes to me from Amazon, then I'm going to pay them that, right? I'm not even paying them for the software, I think, as much as the service. And that's what they've done a brilliant job of, as has Google and every cloud provider. DigitalOcean has a great Kubernetes, right? That's all fair game. So there's this interesting divide at the moment. So how have the software vendors decided to fight back? Well, to some extent, they're fighting back with licensing. That's the debate we're in right now, which is, can I license differently to protect myself from the public clouds a little bit? So what are the popular ones that have popped up even in the last 12 months? So they all have different names. So the business source license, MariaDB has this one. So usage below a certain level is actually free. So maybe like over 25 users, that's when you start paying. That's the license. So you can use everything until you get to be too many people. All right, that's not actually open source at this point. It's just a license. That's one option. CockroachDB, popular database, kind of the open source spanner, if you will, like Google. They've got a community license that says a bunch of the feature, everything has source code, but you can't distribute most of it or some of these features, right? So I can use it, but I'm not in a position where I could actually use this in my own product and sell it. There's certain characteristics there. So they're trying to limit how you use it as just part of your apps and maybe not part of your products, at least for some of their proprietary stuff. The one that really caused a whole dust up last year with Redis, it was called the Commons Clause. And this one was focused on, it kind of added to your existing license and said that you can't sell that software without specifically adding value, right? And if you add value to it, then you can't just take my thing and sell it as a service. So if it's a Redis module that does search, you can't just say, I'm going to run the Redis search as a service and make money off it. Not allowed. You have to do something to actually make it better, and then you're allowed to sell that. Now, actually, at the moment, I can't find anyone using this. So I think this one came up when Redis Labs launched up, and then Redis Labs changed theirs, which we'll talk about in a second. I don't think anybody's using this one at the moment unless you're familiar with someone. No? Okay. Confluent, also part of this licensing extravaganza, came up with the community license. So this said you can access, use, redistribute all the source code, but you can't compete with us. Which that's interesting, because how do you define competition? You can get into maybe some squirrely territory there, but again, this is a straight up behave yourself Amazon sort of licensing. Like you can't sell Kafka as a service, at least with our proprietary stuff. Now all of these don't impact the open core, right? Anybody can take Kafka core and run it as a service. It's fully, I think it's whether Apache 2 or GPL, whatever the license is, I can run that without any fear of retribution. But if I take the really useful stuff that Confluent has also added to Kafka, I can't run that as a service, right? That's what they're saying here. You can't do that. If you do, we'll come after you with lawyers and things. So that's one way, again, to try to protect yourself is to say all the cool stuff that we sell, you can't copy as a managed service. MongoDB, so they just changed theirs, the server-side public license. So more or less, all the source code's covered, but if you run Mongo as a service, you have to open source everything you use to run it as a service. So Amazon's response to this was, we'll build a database that looks like Mongo, doesn't run any Mongo code, but implements a Mongo API. Gotcha. So, I don't know, maybe predictable, but that was what happened there, right? Microsoft does the same thing with Cosmos. It's not unique to Amazon. So, again, maybe well-intentioned, but the natural behavior of a cloud is not to be held hostage by a software vendor. It's probably to copy them. So, I don't know if that had the intended effects. And then finally, the last one to point out here is the what was renamed the Redis Source Available license. So again, I can see all the stuff, I can use all the stuff, but I can't actually distribute it within any sort of product that qualifies as a database. So I can't sell, again, a database as a service with these sort of bits. That's not allowed. So in all these cases, the point was to, for the most part, limit someone from running this as a service, if it wasn't them, right? Obviously, Mongo runs Atlas, makes sense. But for the most part, this was kind of a way to fight back on this sort of thing. Anybody, I don't know, is this a good strategy? What do you think? Yeah?
I think in the commons clause with icons and images, not so much concern.
Icons and images for Commons Clause, okay.
Too early to tell.
Might be. I mean, we've seen obviously early indications about what Amazon did with Mongo and even Elasticsearch, right? I mean, the biggest kerfuffle the last week is that.
Mongo and Elasticsearch are old, right, or are they going to prosper?
We're going to get to that. So you're right. So is this even a problem in the first place, or are these companies still making tons of money hand over fist, and there's just a growing pie? It's not actually a zero-sum game, potentially. But is this strategy going to yield the behavior you want? I don't necessarily see any of the public clouds going, you're right, I would like to use all the Redis modules, I will go ahead and pay you for that. We'll see who the first one is. I don't think there'll be a first one, but we shall see.
So no one's taken up the server-side public license?
I haven't seen any service provider accommodate any of these. Now, some of these are new, again, so we're also early days, but and maybe a smaller provider would take up on this, right? If I am a DigitalOcean, I'm a Linode, somebody who says, yeah, I want that stuff enough that it's worth licensing and I can just pass through the charge. So arguably from some of this, one thing's, yeah, question?
Is the server-side public license differentiated meaningfully from AGPL?
I think that was anything you also improved on the service you had to open source. Isn't that right? Like anything you added to the service you had to also share, I believe, with AGPL. This was really focused on running it as a service, the machinery for provisioning, management, update. So I think it wasn't even you're changing the open source, you're changing how you deliver the open source, I think.
Similar spirit but broader?
Mm-hmm. So my friend Stephen O'Grady, who works at RedMonk, has been writing a lot about this stuff in this space. He said arguably, if you look at where we're going, the API that's available in open source is more important than the software. And we're kind of seeing that with everyone copying a Kafka API, a Mongo API. Right? We're seeing that the interface is actually being implemented multiple different ways. And if you're a Spring user, look, I wrote a blog post last month where I built a Spring Boot app that used the Mongo kind of bits for Spring, and I made that work without code changes on a Docker image, the Amazon Document DB, Azure Cosmos DB, and Mongo as a service. Right? So because you've implemented the API, even though 2 of those 4 options weren't actually even Mongo, it just works. Same with Kafka, same with Kubernetes, same with a lot of these things that are becoming standard interfaces. I think that's an interesting proposition that if I'm an open source developer, is the API I'm building something I need to think about delivering and protecting more than the software itself? Then we get into this world where you have Oracle and Google fighting over API license. You know, is that a world we want to live in either, where you're actually patenting APIs? Like that's a dangerous place. But the API seems to be the thing that we're actually trying to implement more now than the software. So I will leave you with a few questions. And again, Adrian, who's now at Amazon, tweeted this last week to your point. Like Mongo's making a ton of money. They just had great earnings. Elastic just went IPO with a ton of money. So is anyone actually suffering here? Or is this just a bunch of faux outrage over something that's not actually a problem? Not wrong, right? There's a lot of these companies still making plenty of money monetizing open source while Amazon looms over them and terrifies them. It doesn't seem to be impacting revenue. So is this actually a problem, or is it just too early in the ball game, and 5 years from now this is going to be just a landscape littered with carcasses of open source companies with just cloud providers left? I think that's the conversation for beers. So what would be the things we consider here? I did kind of ask a question to start this. And I think we have to think about if we believe in a future where public cloud becomes the dominant deployment choice and we're running up just managed services, managed databases, managed identity, right? All these sort of things, managed messaging. What's the role of a software vendor who ships software? Like, why would I ever buy a database from a software vendor if I always just want to consume it as a service? And then I'm just writing functions or something to connect them all. So in that future, I don't know why I would necessarily buy a service. Now, we might say that future won't happen. We're not all going to switch to public cloud for another 20 years, plenty of time, and we come back, we might do multi-cloud. Like, there's no certain future that says we're going to be stuck with 2 clouds in 5 years and nobody has on-prem. Therefore, I would never install Nginx, I would never install Mongo, I would never install Cassandra. I don't know, right? But in that future, you have to kind of answer that question. You have to game that out a little bit. I mean, do I care about licenses in a cloud world? Are we moving away from that, especially again, as cloud providers don't seem to care to some extent what those are? So is licensing a right avenue of attack here? Or if you were a software vendor today building something really interesting, hey, your WSO2, again, your Pivotal, your DataStax, or any of these companies, what is the right strategy? Is it to offer a managed service like Mongo's doing with Atlas? Right? Is that the right strategy? Is it to somehow have an easier license so a cloud provider does partner with you like Amazon has done with Chef? Like Azure has done with Databricks, right? There are partnership agreements which are super lucrative for those companies. It's not like open source is only swallowed by cloud. There are times where the companies actually partner. So I mean, that, my first question, you can argue my whole session from the whole talk is like, well, no, of course, open source doesn't get killed by cloud. I don't know. I don't know. Now, does it kill front-end frameworks? No. I mean, how can a cloud's not going to kill React or Angular or Spring or things like that? That doesn't really make much sense. I still have to run software. But with networking infrastructure, with databases, with operating systems, do those matter the same in a managed services world? I just don't know, right? Would I ever want to pay for an operating system in 5 years? Probably not. Personally, like in a cloud world, when am I ever dealing with an OS? I'm going to deal with a K8s cluster, a function platform, a PaaS. When am I patching an operating system? Like who's paying for an operating system in 5 years? That's probably crazy, at least in a cloud world. So what does this mean, right? So if you look at every public cloud provider today, if you look at their catalog I showed you of what things they've commercialized, none of them are network stacks, right? Very few of those are things like machine learning. So there's certain layers of the stack. Do I care about load balancer products in a few years in a cloud world? I don't know. Does Nginx have a future in the public cloud only world? I don't know. These are interesting questions to ask, though, just as does cloud become such a dominant model that it changes how we think of software today? I mean, if I'm a VC, do I back an open source company today? I think, again, it's a fascinating question, is how would someone come to you going, this is the best database that's going to somehow be different than the other 45 databases available in every segment today, and we're going to win over licensing? Oh, gosh, I don't know. Am I giving you 10 million? That seems kind of crazy. So if I'm a VC, if any of you came up with a great open source, especially middleware product, right? Open source, other frameworks, AI, ML, distributed systems, maybe something there. But like a data service, a messaging service, do you think you could get money for that from a VC, and why? Why would they think you could win when it's obviously a super tricky landscape? Again, I think that's a fun question to debate for us.
There's a VC firm that came, or not just a VC firm, but the person from the VC firm that specifically is venture-backed OS stuff now.
Sure.
So it's interesting. Like a lot of the questions were like, so how are you figuring out how you're investing to get a return?
Right.
It's not very obvious in this particular case. So.
Yeah, I mean, I've asked a few questions here, but yeah, what do you think of some of the answers to these?
I recently had an experience, so I was like really surprised. At the local conference, there were a few VC people came to, like I worked with T-Mobile, so they wanted to see how we're using some of these projects.
Sure.
And so I was like really surprised that these people are just reaching out to folks that are representing like big companies and understanding how these things are used so that they can actually support those products.
Mm-hmm.
They are forecasting, right?
Interesting.
They are forecasting, their opportunity.
Right. I mean, there's good research happening there. Yeah.
I feel like the question also compares to the question like, would a VC back a company building a new tire? Like, aren't those products that we have now in that space, unless there's some new use case that requires a new type of database, do we really need another database?
I just don't know. I mean, so where my head went with this is, would I have a VC firm backing like a cobbler? Or do we not have cobblers anymore? Like, would I back a database company when it's all big database as a service cloud companies? If that's the paradigm, right? That might not be the case. We might never move to that model. But would I back a product that potentially becomes a as a service commodity that a cloud provider swallows up, and I can't make a business out of it? So I just don't know if you're almost pitching tires in a world where we have flying cars. No, I wouldn't back a tire. Tires are irrelevant in whatever time period.
Despite the fact it's not relevant, you have the case of Docker. Docker got a ton of venture capital money, and they're doing incredibly successful from a community perspective. They were bringing a hugely innovative product, but they cannot make money.
No, yeah, they haven't figured out how to make any of that money that they've raised.
I think that's part of the problem.
Which is
with
tricky.
Docker is you see that a lot of the Docker community has moved to contributing to the open source, and then that's being taken up by other providers, and they can't even get traction with their own orchestrator. So.
Well, I mean, that's where open source has always kind of flipped the funnel, where I've got to first get everyone using my stuff. I can't start off selling a product. I have to start by making this stuff almost ubiquitous. And by the time I've done that, people are going to commercialize, or I'm never going to pay the vendor. I mean, so nobody wants to pay Docker money, even though it's ubiquitous. I don't know, it's so fascinating to see. Yeah.
So another thing to put on this list is, if there isn't a path for open source to be sustainable in terms of making money, open source communities to make money, then is the innovation supply chain at a risk?
I honestly, I think that's one of the most interesting questions in this, is that does my motivation go down to contribute or create? I mean, if we go back to one of the first quotes I put up there, which is every major thing happening in IT, like at scale in the last 10 years has been from open source. Does that dry up a little bit if I don't have the incentive to invest there because I'm about to get stomped by some well-funded sort of company?
Will all innovation on platform and infrastructure come from cloud providers?
And what does that, sure, so it will all come from cloud providers, and is that going to be the same thing? Or even if it doesn't, is there going to be this sort of wasteland period between when clouds are ubiquitous and no one wants to build stuff because clouds swallow it, and then we just kind of have an awful 10 years there? Like, I think it's a great question to ask, and again, maybe it doesn't happen, but would my, again, capitalistic incentives go away because the company I want to create or that product idea I have, I'll never make any money off of? Yeah, Adrian.
I was just going to say, you look at every industry, though, there's always like a research investment curve, right?
True.
I mean, it happened with railroads, planes, trains,
Sure.
housing, all sorts of stuff. And as soon as you kind of hit a peak return on the awesomeness of the new thing, the research and investment goes away from the private sector.
Sure.
If you get any advancement, you have to go to something that can eat huge losses. Hell, we might even be there in, say, the airline industry soon.
I mean, that's where I go back to even corporate sponsorship, is do I need someone with deep pockets who can try this open source stuff, see if these projects land, and I'm not going to go broke if it goes flat. Versus, again, that services and support model or those other things where I have to have success before I can kind of pull that thing off. Who cares in some of these other worlds? Google can do Kubernetes till forever and make zero money on it, and nobody really cares because they're just an ad company, generally, of course. So,
the question is, I think most open source businesses are sustainable. I mean, they cannot be like venture capital, when you use a 10 or 100x.
I know, but all those
investment. I think that would be
sure, but there's been a ton of
expectations that this is going to become.
You're right. But there's been a ton of investment, obviously, in open source.
It's
VC.
only profitable, they can great life, having a strong community,
Right.
being, healthy.
Yeah.
I know this is not directly related to the topic of this talk, but I was just kind of curious to get your thoughts on like consumption of open source within like large IT companies. Because if you think about the product vendors that you talked about, right, they have dedicated teams, they do a good due diligence in terms of really looking at these projects and determining risks and whatnot. So they're doing their part. But often, and that may not be the case in bigger enterprises. I see a bit of a danger or risk, like you just kind of blindly consume something, build, some, workload and ship it to prod, and then all of a sudden, you're not keeping up with what's happening in that project, or Have you seen like or
Yeah, I mean,
have you
they're,
felt the same way, like maybe working with customers, like
Sure.
I'm seeing this internally, like I bring this up, within our company, like
Sure.
we push for both contributing and also consumption of open source.
no, you're our customer, so I have to keep you happy. But I mean, in this world, I mean, 10 years ago, right, this idea that enterprises used a lot of open source was still kind of laughable because it was still, of course, we're going to buy big commercial stuff because that's safe and open source is for weird hipsters. And now we've kind of flipped this mode where, I don't know, if you're not doing open source in the enterprise, you're not even a Luddite, you're just missing out. But what's been interesting is how many companies have also now have permissive open source policies to create, which is awesome, right? More and more companies actually encouraging people to contribute. To your point though, how are you staying up on it? Because it's really easy to grab code from GitHub and stick it in prod and then miss the 55 updates over the last 6 months that are security related, feature related. So that leads everybody back to then a commercial packager provider because that company's job is to keep me updated all the time, right? If you bought Pivotal's Kubernetes thing, we've updated 20 times in the last 12 months with security updates and things. Are you going to do that yourself? No, right? It's really hard. People, that's why they're 10 versions behind on things because that's a hard job. So it's always funny. It leads like we used open source, I think, to free ourselves. You hoped, like, oh, we don't want to pay those monsters at Oracle anymore, so we're going to use MySQL. How's that working out for you? Aren't you just paying someone else for MySQL support? Like, did we really get away from it? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it. Yeah, nasty Oracle guy. I love Dave. He's
No problem. All good. The thing I want to say is that in a way you circled back and answered your own question because you're using that as an example of somebody providing services in addition to the OSS product, right?
Sure.
Which was kind of the first business case anyway.
But most of them open core.
Yeah.
Like most of those companies are adding stuff, security, patching, updates, whatever.
The reason I'm bringing that up again is because you're saying, well, what does that feature look like? And what I'm suggesting to you is that looks like services. And I'll use the example of the 2 examples that were raised. One of them was tires.
Mm-hmm.
Well, right now, everybody wants to ship stuff because they're buying online. Do you know what the wait time is for a truck? If you went to Packard down the road here and you wanted to buy a truck, the wait time is over 18 months. Okay? What's the most consumable thing that they desperately use and need replacement of? Its tires. So that's why Michelin is going out of their way. Michelin was actually considering drone delivery of tires. Okay, seriously, they got a license to deliver tires by drone because they understand that keeping those trucks moving and keeping their customers happy, which is a service-oriented deal. The next thing I'll tell you is that at the Mobile World Congress, if you go out on YouTube, you can see Dieter, the chairman of Mercedes, making this statement. We were the original car manufacturer and we've made cars, but now we recognize that the car is just a platform and our future is in services.
Yeah.
And the margin in services, it's only 2% of our business, but that 2% is some astronomical number, and therefore we can't afford not to look at it. So they're all about developing services for the car, which takes us back to the services around the OSS.
Is there enough of a business on it, at least in tech? That's a tricky question. Just given the cost of running a tech company, can I make enough when 1% of my customers pay me service money? I don't know. Maybe at scale. Yeah.
I just want to say there was an interview with called Scaling Hack Corp on Software Engineering Daily a few weeks ago, and they basically said the first 4 years they were a well-funded research project, and then they found out that people actually want to pay for enterprise licensing, so they came up with that after a couple of years because they were lucky to have funding from the start.
Right.
They didn't really have a business plan. That's an interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Any other thoughts on if we hit this, again, world of mostly managed services, why would I go, what's the future for the software vendor who actually does all the OSS work?
You spoke briefly about copywriting APIs,
Yeah.
and Oracle. As a kind of corollary to that, software patents, maybe protecting implementation, and how might that relate to, failure or successful licensing? Like if your database comes
Sure.
to you, right, with a novel, and better implementation strategy, right, with a generic API.
Right.
Maybe you maybe protect yourself with, by being patent troll instead of
Yeah, I mean,
novel licensing.
It's a great
Great
question. I
question.
can't imagine that the big clouds aren't getting patent trolled to death by everyone, like obscure sort of simple feature that they implement in their databases or what have you. I haven't seen it employed by the software vendors who are making the open source as a protection technique. And again, most of them get really dogged about the licensing stuff. And again, I think it's unfair. Sometimes the criticism against the software vendors building open source is just compete better. I don't think that's totally fair when you're up against a mega cloud provider with 50 data centers and just a sort of audience that's unprecedented, right? We have nothing to compare this to. So I don't think compete better is totally fair. So I recognize trying to think of novel ways to at least somehow protect the things you're really investing in. I haven't seen patents at the moment used as a technique.
Could that also be a place where
Antitrust stuff?
Antitrust stuff?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'd hate to get to a world where that's the requirement,
It's
but
like breaking apart the buying up the whole like, top to bottom stack.
well, I mean, that's been the complaint with, again, some of the complaint with Amazon, even with Elastic, is this is just a company at this point that prints money that just chooses new places to kind of commoditize something where someone else has a living on it. And that's how the system works. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how our society works. But it is tricky when these very well-funded companies can just zero in on a commodity that someone else built, which I guess is the definition of a commodity. But it's, I don't know. It's a good point, yeah.
So one of the things that is worth considering is most of the cloud providers are closed ecosystems. They don't allow other folks to come and sell managed services on their platform. Few exceptions, marketplace that gives
Sure.
you know, billing integration mostly, but they don't allow anyone behind their API. The one notable exception is the chef
Mm.
in Amazon, but
Right.
there really aren't very much.
It's unusual.
It's quite unusual. So one thing to consider here is if there was an more open cloud provider that enabled commercial open source companies to have a path to a cloud with deep integration, does that solve the problem?
Interesting idea. I feel like you're going to tell me you're selling one, which would be super cool synergy at the moment. But
I had a related question that, with the clouds on their marketplaces offering all these commercial software products for a user to bring in their own license
Sure.
and activate their product, do you think that is on the decline?
it's just the problem is it can't compete with a managed service. So the things in an Azure marketplace or Google marketplace or Amazon marketplace, it's still self-managed. And I'm still necessarily handling the patching, the upgrades. You're simplifying the deployment.
And the integration point. You mentioned earlier that
Sure.
where are these managed services consumed? They're consumed from functions, containers, VMs.
No, those integrations are the killer stickiness, right? You can complain about lock-in. The lock-in comes from the intersection. Then all of a sudden I can add IAM roles and function triggers and all kinds of, it's super smart. That's what you're supposed to do. You're making your product more useful. That's the stickiness, though, that makes it really tough to move it to something else.
I would actually challenge your assertion because a lot of the Microsoft product groups that are building the first-party offerings are building it with the publicly available resource provider APIs. So basically anyone can go in and implement those.
And manage this.
Do they show up on the Azure Management Console
They wouldn't.
as first-class experiences?
I think there is some way to get listed just as high up as the first party. I'm not sure about that.
I mean, it seems like the Mongo Atlas model, again, is nice. I was checking it out again yesterday. Like, you're actually running it in the cloud. You're able to connect to my stuff. They're managing it, and they're experts, right? Amazon will never be running.
Isolated from the cloud provider.
It's in the cloud. It's in Amazon. It's in GCP. It's in Azure, and I can peer it to my account.
Mongo itself runs clusters in the cloud,
Mhm.
but the integration story, like you don't get off integration, you get monitoring, logging, API, CLI, management console, completely independent.
No, you're right. It doesn't integrate with the rest of that cloud stuff, but at least is low latency connected to my
Compared
stuff.
to say Cosmos with Mongo.
No.
Or,
It's so tough to compete with that. Yeah. But you can see it. Confluent's going to be better at running Kafka than anyone else will, right? Redis Labs is going to be better at Redis. So you can see that future. That's a costly future to build up that infrastructure and managed service. So, all right. So we'll keep this going over beers. Hopefully, this stuff is interesting. I think this is again one of those seminal topics for software for the next few years. Is what's going to be that incentive to that question to keep inspiring people to build great open source? There's no, Amazon shipping an Elasticsearch distribution. Technically, that does a favor to everybody. They actually put a lot of great stuff in there, remove some stuff that was intermingled from Elastic. Like, they're technically doing a service. It just feels evil for people who look and go, gosh, I think you're just killing Elastic. But does everyone just win? I think so. It's just how are you going to make sure the Elastics and all these companies over time keep having an awesome path so they keep innovating, right? If that's the selfish goal of everyone in this room is I just want more cool software, how do we keep the people motivated who write that software by making sure they have a business model that they're not entitled to, but they have a path to be able to do that? So anyway, thank you for this. Hopefully it was fun.
Cool.